I can speak louder, but I assume it's for the TV.
TV.
Okay. So we're going to try to cover this in a few minutes, and yet try and include some of the more important aspects of the flood zone. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the BFE, which is the base flood elevation. And what that is the established elevation nationwide, but particularly for our purposes, for the town of Falmouth, where floodwaters will potentially, the level in which they will potentially come to. It's a 1% chance within any given year that we could have floodwaters at this base flood elevation. And so that's the elevation above sea level, mean high, that the floodwaters in any given area will potentially rise to. So the new maps that are proposed to become effective sometime this year have a different base flood elevation than the current maps have. And in most cases, it's an average of about 1 to 2 feet difference in elevation. Just as an example, the town hall area is in the flood zone A at elevation 11. On the new maps, we'll be at elevation 13. So that means that the base flood elevation, or the floodwaters, will potentially rise to elevation 13 in this area. So the next two things that we're going to consider are the two flood zones that have some significance in terms of construction and also ultimately in terms of insurance. And that's the A zone and the V zone. There are other flood zones, but these flood zones currently are not regulated or not by the building code, and they're not subject to any different types of construction methods. So much of the town of Falmouth, the center of Falmouth, is in the C zone, which is not a hazardous zone. There are other areas that are in the B zone, again, not regulated, not hazardous. There is some chance that in the B zone you could get some minor flooding, but it's not significant. So these are the two zones that are the ones that are significant, and they have impacts in terms of construction. So the A zone, which is what I said the town hall is in, has to do with flooding and the water just rising to a certain level, to that base flood elevation. And then eventually the waters would recede. So construction within that zone is done because of that, and we'll look at some examples in a moment. The velocity zone is basically just what it says. It's velocity waves. So not only will the water rise to the BFE, but in addition to that, you're going to get velocity waves, typically about 3 feet in a severe storm. 3 feet of that BFE is going to be velocity waves. And so those waves will be constantly pounding against whatever structure is in its way. And so the construction in the velocity zone, understandably, is going to be different than construction in an A zone because of these velocity waves, and because typically in the velocity zone, the elevations are higher. So for example, on Surf Drive, where we have those cabanas and so forth, and anyone who was around for Hurricane Bob knows what happened there. Well, the BFE in that area currently is at 16 feet. It will go up to about 18 feet. So, and that's the reason why when they rebuilt some of those cabanas, that's the reason why they're elevated. So they had to be at or above the base flood elevation in that area. And so that's why they're up. So, an A zone, this is a typical house that's built in an A zone. This is the grade, the existing grade around the house. So if someone has a situation like this, and what's going to happen when the new maps go into effect, individuals who may not have been in a flood zone will be in a flood zone. So in a situation like this house was probably in a C zone, okay, or a B zone. Now under the new maps, they would be in an A zone. And this house would then automatically be non-compliant with regard to the building code. Because under the building code, it says that you cannot have enclosed space on all four sides below grade. And this house has that. It has a basement below grade on all four sides. So it's now non-compliant. So what happens is the base flood elevation, say for example, the grade here is at elevation, these are just typical or just examples. The grade here is at elevation 10. The BFE is at elevation 12. Which means that this entire basement is going to be filled with water if we have a flood that brings the water to the base flood elevation. And that's the reason why in an A zone, you're not allowed to have enclosed space below grade. So in this particular situation, if this were new construction, they would not have a basement. They would have no enclosed space below grade. So to bring this house into compliance, they would have to fill in this area so that the slab inside, or the grade inside, would be equal to or greater than the grade outside. And then in addition to that, because the floodwaters are still going to come up another 2 feet, they would then have to provide openings in this crawl space area that would allow the waters to go in and out. And an example of that would be this is one manufacturer known as a smart vent, but it is designed to automatically allow the waters to go in and to come back out. So that when that base flood elevation was reached, the water would, rather than providing hydrostatic pressure against the building and perhaps causing some failure or even buoyancy in lifting the building, this would allow the water to go in and go out safely without causing a problem to the structure of the building. Though the number of these, the size of these, how many and where they're placed, that's all designed as part of the foundation. And obviously you need to design it so that it will allow enough water in and enough out so that it doesn't create a structural problem for the building. So as I said, in new construction, this would be looked at the time that they would apply for a building permit. And so we would not allow them to have this enclosed space below grade. But in some cases, as I mentioned, because you may not have been in the flood zone, you would have this situation, or because the house was built prior to 1975, which is when the building code went into effect. It could have a basement and still be in a flood zone and not in compliance. So that's the situation if you're in an A zone. In addition to that, any mechanicals or electrical panels and all that would also have to be brought up so that they would be out of the base flood elevation. Who pays for it? No, they don't pay for it. The homeowner would have to pay for it. Or, if you don't correct that, then your insurance premiums are going to be astronomical. Now, in last night's meeting, we had an insurance person and someone from the bank that shared what some of those costs could be and what there is some grandfathering for pre-1974 houses construction, and there may be some grandfathering for primary residence. But if it's not a primary residence or if it's sold, then that will become an issue. And basically, you have to just do the numbers and see what is it going to cost me for insurance, what is it going to cost me to bring the building into compliance, and then make a decision.
grounds for increasing lot coverage to house utilities and workspace that is being lost? Is there some ability to get a variance for that, or is that something maybe we should think about?
That may be something you can think about. Currently, there is no provision for that, to extend the lot coverage because of that.
That could be a real hardship for some people.
On a very small lot, yes, it could possibly be. So, in an A zone, your lowest floor, including the crawl space, has to be at or above the base flood elevation. And anything that's below that has to provide those vents. And you can't have mechanicals or any of that. Okay? So, now we go to the more restrictive zone, and that's the V zone. So again, we take, for example, Surf Drive. Say we have an elevation of 10 again, but now we need a BFE of 16. So now we're going to be 6 feet in the air. And in the V zone, it is the lowest structural member that has to be at or above. Now, in fact, under the state building code, in a V zone, the BFE may be 16, but the state building code says that you have to have what they call freeboard, which is a measure of safety. So you would have to be at elevation 18, 2 feet above whatever the base flood elevation is. And that's with the lowest structural member, not the lowest floor like in the A zone. The lowest structural member has to be 2 feet above whatever the base flood elevation is. And again, keep in mind, the reason for that is that we're talking about velocity waves that are hitting this structure. And so if you have this structural member in the path of that velocity wave, it can destroy that building. The other thing that you cannot do in a velocity zone is to have enclosed space. So, and the only other provision that they have is to have what they call, the code calls breakaway walls or breakaway panels. And there are a couple of houses on Surf Drive. The houses are elevated. When you drive by, you don't even notice that the houses are on piers because they have infilled with breakaway panels, and it looks like it's a solid wall, but in fact it's not. It's designed to automatically collapse in the event of a storm, of a flood that brings the floodwaters up that high. So that the velocity wave will hit that, and those panels will fall out, and they have to be tethered so that they don't go flying off into somebody else's house. But they collapse, and it allows the water to go, the velocity waves to go in and past. And because it's on piers, those piers, the water will basically go around those and not destroy this house. And that's why if you've seen pictures of Louisiana and other places where you might have one house that's still standing and everything else has gone around it, it's because it was built by this standard, and it allowed the waters to go in and out without damaging the building. If these breakaway panels do not collapse, then eventually under that velocity waves, this building will be destroyed. So again, the V zone is much more restrictive and requires that you be built on piers, and all of your mechanicals and everything must be above the base flood elevation and required by the building code an additional 2 feet. Towns can be more restrictive. Towns can be more restrictive than the building code. They can't be less restrictive. So we could not decide that we don't think that the floodwaters are ever going to get that high, so let's just allow people to build lower. We can't be less restrictive. We can be more restrictive. And in some cases, the Conservation Commission has required that freeboard as well to make it higher. So, but the building code in the V zone requires it 2 feet. Now, what happens if I have a structure that is non-conforming? And then I'll wrap this up, because I can talk as long as you want me to, but I'll wrap this up. I have a house that is in an A zone based on the new maps. And I have a basement, and I want to do some work to my house. what the state building code says, that if you exceed 50% of market value of that structure, if the cost of those renovations are going to be greater than 50% of the market value of that structure, then this entire structure has to conform. You have to bring it into compliance. If it's less than 50%, then you do not have to bring it into compliance. So that's part of your answer, Richard. However, that doesn't do anything for you in terms of your insurance company. That's a separate matter altogether. We're just strictly talking about what the building code requires. So once you exceed that 50% of the market value, and we use assessed value unless you want to go out and have it assessed, and then we require that you get 2 appraisals, and we take the least of the 2. And then based on that number is where we start our 50%. So for example, I have a house that's worth $100,000, and I want to do $60,000 worth of work, then this entire building is going to have to conform, which would mean, as I mentioned earlier, filling in that basement, getting all of my utilities above the basement elevation, and bringing it into compliance. And the thought process is that if you're spending that amount of money, then you need to include bringing it up to code. If you're going to spend, 70 or 80% of the value of the house and increase it by that much, certainly you would want to protect that by making it conform. Okay. So that's that number. And the same is true with the velocity zone, only there is one little caveat with the velocity zone, which makes it much more restrictive. And that is, you have your 50% of the assessed value, but we also have a 200 square foot restriction, which says that if you add or create habitable space 200 square feet in a velocity zone, it is the same as substantial improvement. It's the same as if you did 50%, more than 50%. And in that case, you would have to bring it into compliance in the velocity zone. So that's only in the velocity zone, that 200 square feet. But in an A zone, it is the 50%. Now, if, for example, you wanted to put a lateral addition onto a non-compliant structure, if that lateral addition is more than 50% of the assessed value of the structure, then the lateral addition would have to comply, not the entire structure, if it's lateral. However, if you were going to take the floor off, the roof off, and put a second floor on, now that's different. That's no longer a lateral addition. If that's 50%, then the whole structure would have to conform. So there are some provisions that would allow an individual to do things to their home without making it conform. But again, it's at 50%, or in the case of the V zone, the 50% and or the 200 square feet.
Just a quick question. As things exist now, any house that has a foundation, typical basement, in an A zone is non-conforming.
Let me just make one more comment on that so that everybody doesn't panic. If you have a sloping lot, a walkout basement, what the code says is enclosed space on all 4 sides, below grade. So in this case with the walkout, you do not have enclosed space on all 4 sides. So as long as this lower level is above or at the same level as the lowest grade outside, then that's not considered a basement. However, even in this scenario, if, for example, the BFE is there and that basement floor is here, although you're allowed to have that because of the walkout, you can't have any mechanical, you still can't have any mechanicals below the basement elevation, and any materials that you have below the basement elevation have to be water resistant. So you couldn't have ductwork, you couldn't have electrical, you couldn't have drywall, anything that you would use has to be water resistant. So the wood would be pressure treated, the wall coverings would have to be like a Durarock or something that would be water resistant. So you couldn't use ordinary building materials below the basement elevation. But in this situation, because the lot slopes, as long as that floor is not lower than the lowest grade outside, then that would still be considered a compliant house. Also, you still would have to have vents that's going to let the water in and out, because the water level is going to get up to there in the, you know, when we have that storm.
Jim?
Thank you, Mr. Gore. That was very concise and clear. I just want to expand on one thing about the grandfathering, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the grandfathering does go away, that they're going to increase it 25% a year until it goes away. So it's not a grandfathering forever. It's just this year, next year, and the year after that, and then everybody's the same.
That's correct.
That's all I wanted to say. Yep.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you.
Thank
And I
you.
hope it was informative.
It was great.
Very much so.
Very
Thank
clear.
you.